Professor Murray, thank you for your time on a Sunday evening. Well, essentially, Professor Cannon was originally asked to discuss the epidemiology of schizophrenia, and she's unable to make it. And like
Well,
psychiatry,
I'm delighted to be a substitute for Mary Cannon.
well, well, I'm the Cinderella, I guess, because I always get last choice, and there's no one better, I think, in the world or the universe to talk about the epidemiology of schizophrenia and to just put it in context for members of the BAP. So thank you for making your time in the evening more than anything else. And I guess this would all start with when we're looking through the epidemiology of schizophrenia. Well, where did you start with that?
Well, I started by going to the funeral of James Shields, who had been the geneticist at the Maudsley, and only me and the professor of psychiatry, Dennis Hill, went. So on the way back, he gave me a lift and he said, I've got this twin register. I think I'll have to shut it down. So I said, no, don't shut it down. I'll look after it for a little while. And he said, but you don't know anything about twins. I said, yes, well, we'll send you around Scandinavia. So I went around Scandinavia for 6 weeks, and they didn't talk about genetics. They talked about obstetric complications. And so I came back all enthused about this and told people, various professors, about obstetric complications being important in the etiology of schizophrenia, and they laughed me out of court. But fortunately, Sean Lewis, who was my registrar and then research fellow at the time, didn't laugh. And he went through lots of CT scans, about 500 CT scans, and he kept turning up developmental abnormalities. And he would say, Robin, do you think schizophrenia could be developmental? And I would say, no, it's obviously degenerative. And he kept on saying this. And eventually, after a little while, he persuaded me. And therefore, we wrote a paper on schizophrenia as a neurodevelopmental condition. So from there, we got into looking at biological epidemiological factors like pregnancy complications, prematurity, hypoxia, and prenatal infection. And so then, of course, we spent a lot of time arguing that schizophrenia was neurodevelopmental. And of course, we've been too successful in that. So now lots of people believe schizophrenia is a neurodevelopmental disease, which of course I'm now a bit wiser, and I realize it's only a component of schizophrenia that's a developmental. Amazingly, the hypothesis was supported by neuropathological findings, which showed that people with schizophrenia had neural migration abnormalities in the hippocampus. And this was a study done by a man called Scheibel. And an American neuropathologist said to me, just because Scheibel has reported something, it's not necessarily always wrong. But in this case, it was wrong, and nobody ever replicated this. So the developmental hypothesis was part founded on a fiction. But then Peter Jones looked at the childhood precursors, and we learned that the children who developed schizophrenia, especially those who had a developmental insult, were a bit deviant and slower to reach their milestones, and lower premorbid IQ and more minor neurological signs and so on. So by the early 90s, I was really quite interested in epidemiology.
Now that makes total sense. And it was the fact that people were replicating those cohorts in the work of Peter Jones, wasn't it? If I remember correctly.
Yes,
literature.
There came a little sort of industry of wherever people had cohorts in Finland or in Israel. So these were largely replicated. And then so Peter Jones and I wrote a big program application to the MRC in 1996 to look at biological factors in schizophrenia, and it was turned down by the MRC, particularly by the chairman of the board, who was Bob Kendall, who said, you've applied, for this grant, looking at biological factors in schizophrenia. And Julian Leff from your same institute has applied to look at social factors in schizophrenia. Do you never talk to each other? And the answer was no, we don't ever talk to each other. And so they said we'll consider a joint application from the two of you. I was infuriated. I didn't want to get muddled up with all this social stuff. But anyway, we applied jointly, and of course, the social factors turned out to be much more important than the biological factors. I mean, we looked at MRI scans and found the usual minor abnormalities, but we really got into finding childhood adversity and migration and urbanicity, and actually we didn't look at drug abuse at that time, but that collaboration, which set off some very important careers, such as Craig Morgan, now professor of social psychiatry, and Paula Dazan. They started as PhD students and ended up as professors. So then it's interesting how one is blinded. I never looked at social factors, never thought they would have any consequence in the etiology till the mid-1990s. And I never thought that drug use was of any relevance either. So in the ESOP study, we didn't even collect decent data on cannabis use. So now we think that child abuse and drug abuse are perhaps the most important environmental etiological factors. But I spent 20 years ignoring the two of them.
But you changed your mind, and Aesop was no fable, right?
No, Aesop was had a very good title. Peter Jones coined the title, and it also spawned a lot of other sort of daughters. So the Aesop study spawned the GAP study, and also in the UK, and that then spawned the EUGI study across 16 sites in Europe, and then that spawned the Intrepid study across 3 centres in India, Nigeria, and Trinidad. So now we have accumulated similar data across these different sites. And one of the things that you find, of course, is that the incidence varies very dramatically. And as I'm sure, as you know, that incidence is much higher in London than it is in Southern Europe. And that's partly due to migration and partly due to high potency cannabis. But one of the factors which is often overlooked is if the risk factors are different and the incidence is different, then the condition will look different. So I see much more psychopathy and
that's not at the institute, no.
Yeah, no, not amongst my colleagues. They've always been psychopathic. No difference there. But I think there's more violence. And I think one of the reasons for that is that there is a new avenue into schizophrenia, and that is through conduct disorder in adolescence and risk-taking in adolescence and drug abuse, pushing people into schizophrenia who would not have been schizophrenic before. So I think now neurodevelopmental schizophrenia is less important than it used to be, whereas drug-induced schizophrenia is more important, and also social adversity, particularly in migrants, is more important. So if you try and replicate characteristics of schizophrenia in different centres, you won't necessarily be able to do so.
And that's interesting, because I guess Bob Kendall, IPSS study, things have changed since then, in that the IPSS was saying incidence is roughly similar, a bit different in the developing world, but generally seen. But what you're saying is the phenomena that happens over time and our evolution in terms of drug taking or our environment has meant that actually when we study it properly, there is a disparity in the incidence in different countries.
Yes, and we weren't the first to show that. That was John McGrath who showed that very clearly. But the ESOP study and the EUGI definitely showed that. And of course, also that urbanicity, which became a dogma, that incidence was higher in urban areas. We've shown that that only occurs in Northern Europe. In Southern Europe and in developing countries, that doesn't seem to be the case. So there's something toxic about big cities in Northern Europe. So things like urbanicity, they're really proxies for some. We don't quite know. Is it social isolation? Is it crime? What are the factors that drive the relationship with urbanicity?
Fascinating. Sorry,
So
after you, please.
I think it's very nice to be invited to talk and for perhaps some psychopharmacologists listen to this, because there's a huge gap between epidemiology and neuropharmacology. I think our biological psychiatrists spend a lot of their time trying to divide up the heterogeneity of schizophrenia by looking at those with and without inflammatory markers, cytokines, and so on, or those with and without particular structural brain abnormalities, and so on. Now, none of these things have ever held up. And I think the reason for that is it's much more important to divide up patients by risk factors. So I think the brain abnormalities in neurodevelopmental schizophrenia are very different from the brain abnormalities in drug-induced schizophrenia. So the former are associated with premorbid deficits. The drug users who become psychotic are clever and sociable, and it's having too many friends that gets them into trouble with drugs. So I think you might think that there would be structural and cognitive problems in the developmental patients. You might think that the cannabis-induced patients would be more likely to have abnormalities in the endocannabinoid system, or you might think those who develop schizophrenia consequent upon social adversity might be more likely to have abnormalities of the HPA axis. So I think if we started, well, this is what the cardiologists do. They identify somebody who's had a coronary artery thrombosis, and then they say, what are the causes of that? Is it hyperlipidemia, familial? Is it hypertension? Is it obstetric? Is it obesity, excuse me? Or is it lack of exercise? Is it cigarette smoking? I think we should pay much more attention to this in schizophrenia, both for investigating the characteristics of the illness, but also for treatment. I think the treatment for somebody who has had severe child abuse is going to be very different from somebody who had abused drugs, or again, somebody with copy number variants.
Oh, yes. And you've opened up a lot there, because with cardiology, I remember from public health in Glasgow, the biggest risk factor for heart disease was socioeconomic class. And that had the biggest effect. Now, of course, that gets subsumed under the other things. You mentioned, I guess one of the things with epidemiology sometimes might be reverse causality at times. And you've obviously able to control for that to a degree. What are your thoughts with things like, I guess, the child with major copy number variants or genetic problems or autistic spectrum is probably more likely to be bullied, would you think?
Yes, no, I think that's correct. We did a study of the behaviors associated with having a high polygenic risk score for schizophrenia in the general community. And there was a tendency for people to report that their lives were unhappy and that they were more likely to have bad relations with their parents, and that in a sense they interpreted the world in not quite a paranoid, but a dissatisfied way. So I think these environmental risk factors, there is often a component. If we take cannabis use, then
Yes.
we know that the polygenic risk score for schizophrenia is not it it does not explain away why people take cannabis in the majority of cases, but it does in a very small proportion. About 10% of people who get cannabis-induced psychosis start using the cannabis because they are anxious or they find the cannabis helps them. It's a bit like alcoholism. The majority of people who become alcoholic start because they're in the rugby club or they're in the army or they work in a pub. But a small proportion start because they're neurotic or depressed and find that alcohol helps them.
Self-medication.
So I think there is, we know there is a genetic contribution to many what we call social environmental factors. We got to take that into consideration. But I mean, in cannabis, the evidence is quite clear that those countries or areas where cannabis consumption is very high, then the incidence of psychosis is higher. And also, as cannabis becomes more prevalent, and particularly with legalization and more potent, then you get more people presenting with psychosis. So I personally think we're at the beginning of an epidemic of drug-induced psychosis, cannabis, and also methamphetamines. So I think we may be in the position that the diabetologists were in the 1980s when they were saying there's an epidemic coming and nobody believed them. I think we're unless we do something about the consumption of high potency cannabis, then I think we're going to need a lot more psychiatrists.
And that brings, I guess, onto the cannabis etiological thing, because I guess when you use the Bradford Hill criteria, it's beautiful, actually. And Marta's work with dose response really takes away any of the naysayers, doesn't it?
Well, I think the problem with looking at any social or environmental cause of schizophrenia is that we don't have an animal model. If you look at how did we learn that cigarette smoking caused lung cancer? Well, there was lots of epidemiology which suggested it, but the crucial factor was painting the backs of poor little mice with tobacco, and that they then develop tumors. And the problem is that we don't have a very good animal model. I think now we may have have quite a good model. The Hallup model in mice, developed by Adam Kepex and Katharina Schnapp. So I think an interesting approach is to give different drugs, ketamine, cannabis, to animals and see whether you can actually replicate that particular abnormality. So I think none of the environmental causes of schizophrenia can be proven in the sense of showing the mechanism unless we have a proper animal model, and we've not really had that until now. But I'm quite optimistic that this and some other animal models may bridge this gap.
Animal models of symptoms, I guess, of schizophrenia, would you say, as opposed to the disorder itself?
Well, I'm not a great believer in the disorder itself. I see it just as the severe end of psychosis, and I think it's yes, it's a model of positive symptoms. I guess another thing that epidemiology has shown us is that schizophrenia is not a discrete condition, and that it is the severe end of a spectrum of psychosis that goes right into the community. And the same factors that make people a little paranoid in the general population, such as living in a city or using cannabis or having abused their children, also contribute to schizophrenia, just like the factors that predispose to obesity are the same as the factors that determine weight in the general population.
and with the positive symptoms. And you mentioned John McGrath. I guess a nice contribution was that WHO study where they found the prevalence of the psychotic symptoms in the
Sorry,
population.
I'm distracted because my wife, Marta
Ah,
DePorte, has come in to tell me that Joe
fantastic.
Biden has just withdrawn from the presidential
Well, that's
address.
bigger news, and I'll let you get to that in 2 seconds, if I may.
Right.
But, I think the incidence of symptoms in the population is a major contribution you made as well, because back in the day, in the 80s, people wouldn't consider that, would they? Wouldn't consider psychotic symptoms in a continuum. And following that through, John McGrath's stuff's about 7%, isn't it? Prevalence in the community of psychotic
Yes, so
symptoms.
one of the great things about being a professor is you get attributed things which were really actually devised by other people. And this was Jim Van Oss, who was a research fellow of mine, and he was the first person really to suggest that a significant proportion of the general population had minor psychotic symptoms. And of course, you can study that much more easily than you can study a rare condition like schizophrenia. Can I make a little comment about neuropharmacology too?
You can say whatever you want.
Yeah, I am a bit worried about neuropharmacology because we have had a very good system for determining whether drugs are effective and whether they have a low frequency of side effects, and then they get approval by a medicines agency or the FDA, and therefore we can be quite. We have a good process, which has been developed over very many years. But now there is a rise of what I would call populist psychopharmacology, which I guess is almost Trumpistic, and that is if you shout loud enough for long enough that something is medicinal, then you can try and avoid going through the regular channels. So, for example, the cannabis industry persuades many people that cannabis is a medicine, and that there are some rare conditions for which cannabis is useful. Well, it's useful for some types of childhood epilepsy, and it's modestly useful for pain and for MS, but it's dished out in the US for all sorts of conditions, such as anxiety and depression. And we now have cannabis clinics springing up all across the UK where psychiatrists are prescribing cannabis for anxiety or depression. And the evidence is that the cannabis makes people worse. And I think there is a sort of view that because the population think that this is useful, if psychopharmacologists should get ride this wave and persuade politicians just to allow these drugs to be prescribed widely, or not even to be prescribed, to be utilized widely. And I think this begins to endanger the system that we have developed for approval of drugs. So a sort of general, it means that one can begin to see pressures for the modern equivalents of snake oil to become available, and even some organizations get suborned by the cannabis industry. For example, Drug Science, which was set up to be an independent way of looking at drugs and their adverse effects, that is now hugely funded by the cannabis industry. So one can't really regard it any longer as giving an independent voice. One has to remember whoever pays the piper calls the tune. So I think there is a danger that the orthodox routes through which drugs have been approved may be bypassed.
So it's the only time I can say Robin Murray's been orthodox. Is that fair? No, I take your point, and it's summing things up. I think what's beautiful and what strikes me is you've always let the evidence dictate your way of thinking, and you've changed your thinking in regard to that. I think we all owe you a huge debt in regard to the way that you've brought people up and done the epidemiology in such a fashion that people, when you're explaining to patients, well, why is it my son's developed this or my daughter's developed this? At least we have an empirical basis to at least speak to people to. And I think the field owes you a great deal. But in that
Well,
regard, I think it owes you a lot.
I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not a card-carrying epidemiologist. I had lots of fellows
Yeah.
who trained in epidemiology, and I've learned quite a lot from them. We mentioned some of them: Sean Lewis, Peter Jones, Mary Cannon, Jim Van Os. But I think that the greatest message I can put across is that if you listen to your younger colleagues, they have a fresher mind, and they teach you lots of things, which as a professor you often get the credit for.
Love that. I love that. Well, I think those are words to live by, and your humility is quite something. It's like Fred Astaire, isn't it? Can't sing, can't act, but can dance a little. Lovely dancing with you, Robin, and have a good
Okay,
evening.
nice to talk with you. Bye.
Pleasure. See you soon. Bye bye.